Week 6 of the fantasy football season, and here's the top 36 wide receivers. I'm ranking this week number 1, Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. What a week it was last week versus the Baltimore Ravens in a loss in overtime. 10 catches, 193 yards, and 2 touchdowns. It took a few weeks for Chase to get his legs under him. And this Cincinnati Bengal offense, they're hitting on all cylinders. Their defense has been the problem. So this week in a great matchup at the New York Giants, I think Chase goes out there, has a big performance. Number 2, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. This week a good matchup at the Dallas Cowboys. This Cowboy defense all banged up, and they've given up a lot of points so far this season, even though I know last week they held down the Steelers to 17 points in that victory at the end of the ball game. But this Detroit offense is way better than this Pittsburgh Steelers offense. And St. Brown, he's one of the best receivers in the league, and this week he's going to have a big game, I believe, coming off the bye. Detroit healthy and ready to go. Number 3, staying in the same game, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. He was the first or second wide receiver off the board in fantasy drafts. And he's had some decent games with CeeDee Lamb, but we just haven't seen that monster 30, 35-point ball game for Lamb. But this week versus Detroit, a potential shootout. I think both teams are going to go up and down the field. And CeeDee Lamb, it wouldn't be surprising me if he has his biggest game of the year this week versus this Detroit Lions team. And we saw last season where Lamb exploded for a monster game versus them towards the end. Number 4, Malik Nabers of the New York Giants. Nabers, he's taken the league by storm, is the rookie in his first 4 games. And then last week he missed with a concussion, but I believe he'll return in this one versus Cincinnati Bengals. And we saw last week the Bengals can't stop anyone. Baltimore, they were going up and down the field the whole ball game. And Nabers, he's a generational talent, no doubt about it. And this week, if he's back in the lineup, which I assume he will be, I think he has a big game once again. Number 5, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. A.J. Brown, he's back off injury for this Philadelphia Eagle team. He's missed multiple weeks with the hamstring, but now he's back and ready to go. And this is a decent matchup versus the Cleveland Browns. I know last season the Browns were one of the better defenses in the league, but so far this year that hasn't been the case. I know Denzel Ward might be on A.J. Brown at times in this ball game, but I believe Brown goes out there and he seems most likely he'll be 100%, that they gave him the extra time off, especially coming off the bye week. Number 6, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. London, what a ball game it was last week, 154 yards and a touchdown. And this week a great matchup with the Carolina Panthers, that we know they're one of the worst teams in the league and they can't stop anyone, is Carolina. So London, I'm not saying he's going to go out there for 150 once again, but I believe he could go out there, Drake London, and have another good performance, and him and Kirk Cousins are starting to get things going and getting the rapport down. Number 7, Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Chris Godwin, one of the better slot receivers in all of the NFL. And last week it wasn't a great game for for Chris Godwin, where Mike Evans went out there and had the big performance. But Godwin's a good route runner. We saw last week they had trouble with Juju Smith-Schuster, was the Saint defense in the slot. And we know Baker Mayfield and Godwin, they're hitting on big plays all season long. Number 8, Jaden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. Jaden Reed, it's been a great year when Jordan Love's in the lineup for this Green Bay Packer team. So Reed, one of the best yard after catch wide receivers in the league. This week a great matchup versus Arizona, where their secondary really can't stop anyone. And we saw last week Brandon Ayuk go for 8 for 147, and also George Kittle 7 for 64 and a touchdown. So like I said, their pass defense isn't great, even though last week they won the ball game, Arizona. But I think Jordan Love will have his way in this one, and I think Jaden Reed will have a big game this week. Number 9, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Mike Evans versus division rival nemesis Marshawn Lattimore. We know the battles over the years between these two players, and this week it's going to be another big showdown between Evans and Lattimore covering him in this ball game. But Mike Evans, it's been a great year once again. Last week, 2 touchdowns in that ball game at the Atlanta Falcons, and this week at the Saints. Like I said, I think Mike Evans overcomes Lattimore, has a good game. Number 10, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. Jets fired head coach Robert Saleh. Last week, Garrett Wilson, a monster game, 22 targets. He had 13 catches, 104 yards, and found the end zone. And this week, a decent matchup versus the Buffalo Bills, where their secondary has been leaky at times. So Garrett Wilson, he's a great talent, no doubt about it. Him and Rodgers, though, it's taken him a while to get on the same page. But after seeing last week's game with 22 targets, something obviously you don't really see much in the NFL or anything at all, Garrett Wilson's going to get a lot of work. He's going to get a lot of targets, and he's the Jets' best playmaker. Number 11, DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. Him and Caleb Williams are starting to hit on plays for the Chicago Bear team. DJ Moore found the end zone twice in last week's ball game, 5 catches, 105 yards versus the Carolina Panthers. And this week, another great matchup versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, a defense that can't stop anyone. So I think DJ Moore goes out there once again and has a good game. Number 12, Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. Zay Flowers, one of his better games of the year last week. 7 catches, 111 yards. He's the number one option on this Baltimore Raven offense. Mark Andrews, Isaiah Likely, I know had decent games last week, but for the most part, they've been non-existent in this offense. And Zay Flowers, he's a speedy wide receiver. And this week, I could see another shootout for this Baltimore team versus the Commanders. I like Flowers as a top 12 option. 13, Devon Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. So Smith, he's back off a concussion. And this Eagle team getting reinforcements at the right time. Well, it's wide open, this division. So Devon Smith, he might be tied to some people on this list, but I think he could go out there and have a nice performance as Devon Smith. Like, I'm a bust receiver most weeks, but Devon Smith, I believe, is a perfect number 2 wide receiver. And this Cleveland Brown team, they just can't stop anyone, and we've seen it over the last few weeks here. So Smith, I think he returns from injury and has a nice game. 14, Brian Thomas of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's easily the number 1 wideout on this Jaguar roster. He's making big plays weekly as Brian Thomas. Him and Trevor Lawrence already have a great rapport, including an 85-yard touchdown in last week's victory for the Jacksonville Jaguars. So this week, not a great matchup. Chicago Bears, one of the better defenses in the league, but with volume and his playmaking ability, Brian Thomas has been skyrocketing up the rankings. 15, Brandon Ayuk of the San Francisco 49ers. So Ayuk, like I mentioned early in the video, finally got on the board with a big ball game. 8 catches, 147 yards, and that's with everyone back in the lineup. Debo, George Kittle, besides McCaffrey, obviously, everyone's there. And this week, a good matchup with the Seahawks, where their defense can't stop anyone. And we just saw Darius Slayton go for 8 catches, 122 yards on the Seahawks secondary. So I think Ayuk, once again, could go out there, have a good ball game. Number 16, Stephon Diggs of the Houston Texans. So if you notice, Nico Collins isn't on this ranking list. I don't think he's going to play this week. And Stephon Diggs is going to step in now as the number 1 wide receiver. I believe more targets will go his way. Tank Dell will get an uptick in routes run and targets as well. And this week, a decent matchup of the Patriots, a team he obviously knows for years is Stephon Diggs, playing with the Buffalo Bills in that division. So now is the number 1 wide receiver most likely this week, unless Nico Collins heals quicker than we expect, because the status with him with the hamstring is week to week, and we know that's a tricky injury. So I believe Stephon Diggs, as the number 1, could go out there and have a big game. Number 17, DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. So last week was a down week overall for the Seahawks team. Maybe they were too cocky or whatever the case may be, but they lost to the New York Giants, and DK Metcalf had an off game, 4 catches, 55 yards, and a touchdown. 3 out of 5 games this year, over 100-yard games. I know this week a tougher matchup, but Thursday Night Football, usually high-scoring games. And versus division foe, the San Francisco 49ers, I think Metcalf bounces back. 18, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. Early in the season, he didn't do anything for McLaurin, but the last 2 weeks, he's really picked it up and got things going, and he's the number 1 wide receiver and the main target in this offense, besides Brian Robinson Jr. in the backfield. So this week at Baltimore, potential shootout. Jaden Daniels, one of the better quarterbacks in the league so far, get McLaurin the football, and he's a playmaker still, even though he's been in the league many seasons. So this week, I think at Baltimore, there's going to be points on the board. 19, Marvin Harrison of the Arizona Cardinals. Harrison, so far the first 5 games of his career, it's been an up and down season for Harrison, but we know he's got that number 1 upside. He looks like a number 1 wide receiver and a big play wide receiver. And this week, an easier matchup at the Green Bay Packers than it was at San Francisco, even though I know this Packer team gets to the quarterback. They get sacks, they create turnovers, no doubt about it, one of the better turnover groups in the league. But I think Marvin, after a bad game last week off of 2 catches, 36 yards, bounces back in this one. 20, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. T. Higgins missed the first few weeks of the season, but now the last couple weeks, he's starting to get things going. And I said it last week. See, right there was T. Higgins. Him and Burrow were just missing on some big plays, but now T. Higgins last week, 2 touchdowns, big performance for the Cincinnati Bengals. And this week, a decent matchup with the New England Patriots, where Joe Burrow's red hot. He's getting the football down the field, getting everyone involved. And I think Higgins is a number 2 wide receiver, is a great option this week for owners. 21, Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers. This week, a good matchup on paper at Seattle, but I believe Deebo's not 100%. Last week, non-existent ball game for Deebo Samuel, but he's got a good track record at Seattle in his NFL career, and I think this week on Thursday night, he bounces back with a good game. 22, Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. So all these Saints are going to take a hit now with Derek Carr out multiple weeks with the oblique injury. So Chris Olave last week, it was a silent ball game on Monday night at the Kansas City Chiefs. This week, I think he still could be decent, even though we don't know who's going to be at the quarterback position for this New Orleans Saints team. So I think this could be a situation possibly like Miami, where once Tua went down, Huntley or Skylar Thompson weren't great options, and we'll see if it's Jay Kaner in this game for this New Orleans Saints team. 23, Deontay Johnson of the Carolina Panthers. So he had 2 big weeks in week 3, week 4, and then last week a dud performance is what it was for Johnson at the Chicago Bears. 3 catches, 24 yards. And this week, matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons coming to town. Their secondary is pretty decent, no doubt about it, for this Atlanta Falcon team. But I think Deontay Johnson could bounce back, and maybe he was a little high in the rankings the last few weeks. But like I said, he's a good possession wide receiver, is Deontay Johnson. He's got good hands and a good route runner. Last week was just a tougher matchup, but a good defense. 24, Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks. Last week, a late touchdown for Smith-Njigba. Definitely salvaged his day. In this offense, they got to get back on track. He's a good prospect coming out of college, was Jackson Smith. Last season, we didn't see much out of him, obviously, but I think this week versus San Francisco in a game that Seattle's got to bounce back after 2 bad losses. I think he has a good game, and they try to get him going early. 25, Darnell Mooney of the Atlanta Falcons. Darnell Mooney, a breakout performance last week. 9 catches, 105 yards, 2 touchdowns versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And this week, a great matchup at the Carolina Panthers, where their secondary can't stop anyone. We just saw DJ Moore come off of 5 catches, 105 yards, 2 touchdowns. And Mooney, good yard after catch receiver, and obviously a great deep ball threat. And him and Kirk Cousins have a great report. 26, George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Last week, a down game, wet game. Game was delayed an hour and a half versus the Dallas Cowboys. This week, indoor game, don't have to worry about that. Great matchup at the Vegas Raiders. And I believe Justin Fields and George Pickens have had a great rapport so far for the most part this season. Just like the T. Higgins thing I mentioned early in the video, Pickens and Fields, they're just missing on some big plays. And this week versus this secondary, I think they're going to start hitting on him. 27, Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions. Williams, he's a boomer bust wide receiver, no doubt about it. But when he booms, he goes out there and he gets a lot of fantasy points. We saw it on Monday night in week 4. Big 75-yard touchdown, easily on a slant route, took it to the house. And this week at the secondary, that gives up big plays, and defense overall that's banged up for the Dallas Cowboys. I think Jameson Williams as a low-end 2 flex option is a good option this week. 28, Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns. So Amari Cooper, he's been dropping down the ranking board weekly over the last few weeks. Him and Deshaun Watson just aren't on the same page. I know the targets were there last week, obviously, with 10 for Amari Cooper. And this week, it's a decent matchup in Philly, where on paper you would think their secondary would be good, but this season they've given up a lot of big plays. But I just can't trust this Brown offense to produce a lot of points, and Amari Cooper to have a monster game. We saw one big game for him versus the New York Giants a few weeks ago, but besides that, we haven't seen much since that week 3 game. So this week, Cooper is a flex option to me. 29, Rashid Shaheed of the New Orleans Saints. Argue and say Shaheed's been the best receiver over there for this New Orleans Saints team. I know he's a deep ball threat for the most part, and if he's not hitting on that, he's not going to make plays. And now with Derek Carr out of the lineup and out multiple weeks with the injury, I think it's going to take a big hit on Rashid Shaheed. We saw it with Tyreek Hill in Miami. His value, Jalen Waddles, took a big hit without Tua in the lineup, and I think it could be similar type of things here for Rashid Shaheed. So this week, he's nothing more than a 3 or low-end flex option. 30, Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. So I don't know if Anthony Richardson's going to play in this game, but to be honest, this offense plays better with Joe Flacco on the center, and we saw it the last 2 games. So this week, it is a tougher matchup on paper at Tennessee, where they got one of the better defenses in the league, and Snead's one of the better corners in the league, I believe, as well. So Michael Pittman, I don't think the ceiling's high, and especially if Anthony Richardson's in there, his ceiling's totally lower. At least Joe Flacco's a gunslinger, and he gets that football spread out into his receivers. 31, Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Christian Kirk, it's been a pretty decent season so far for him. This Jaguar team 1-4 on the season. And Christian Kirk, the first 2 weeks, he didn't do much, but the last 3 weeks in PPR leagues, double-digit fantasy points. So this week, definitely a tough matchup at the Chicago Bears, one of the better defensive units in the league in terms of giving up points and making big stops. But Christian Kirk, the volume is there, and Gabe Davis is pretty much a wide receiver that's faded out of this offense, with Brian Thomas and Kirk as the two top options, even though I know Evan Ingram might return in this game. I'm going to take some targets from Kirk. 32, Tank Dell of the Houston Texans. Tank Dell, he's a solid wide receiver, no doubt about it. He's been banged up a little bit this season, though, is Tank Dell. This week, a matchup at the New England Patriots, where their secondary has been hit or miss so far this season, but they've played a lot of close games and low-scoring games for the most part. But Tank Dell, he's an explosive wide receiver. We saw last season before he went down with the season-ending injury. And this week, with more snaps, most likely with Nico Collins out and more targets, I think he's a good flex option. 33, Shakir of the Buffalo Bills. Shakir missed last week's game with an ankle, and we don't know if he's going to play in this game, but he does get the extra day of rest with this one being on Monday night at the New York Jets. So Shakir is a good route runner. He's the number one option easily, in my opinion, in this offense for this Buffalo Bill team. And I know Sauce Gardner is a good corner, and this Jet defense, one of the better defenses in the league. But Shakir, I still believe, just on targets and volume, could be a decent option if he plays. 34, Wan'Dale Robinson of the New York Giants. I've said this a lot. Wan'Dale Robinson's a good fit in this offense next to Malik Neighbors. Good underneath route runner, yard after catch guy, and he's got good hands as Wan'Dale Robinson. And this week in a matchup versus a weak secondary of the Cincinnati Bengals, I think he could go out there and help fantasy owners. 35, Allen Lazard of the New York Jets. I know he leads the league in drops as Allen Lazard, but he's still finding the end zone and making plays. And it seems like in the red zone, he's been Aaron Rodgers' go-to guy is Allen Lazard. So I know the yards aren't there, the receptions aren't there, but definitely he's been a touchdown player is Lazard with 4 in the season. And this week versus Buffalo, where we've seen their secondary at times have trouble, I think Lazard could go out there once again, have a decent performance. And the 36th and final wideout on rankings, Josh Downs of the Indianapolis Colts. At 2 games this season with Joe Flacco at quarterback, Josh Downs has been a good fantasy option with double-digit fantasy points in those games. And this week, a tougher matchup at the Tennessee Titans. And like I said earlier in the video, if Anthony Richardson's going to be the starting quarterback, everyone's numbers unfortunately go down in the receiving game, where this Colt team don't throw the football a whole lot with Anthony Richardson on the center, leading or trailing in games. So this week, Downs, if Richardson's in there, I don't like the ceiling much. But if he's not, we know been decent so far. Flacco quarterbacks, that's top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking for week 6 of the fantasy football season.